It's June 3rd, 1969, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
So it was today in history in 1969 that the kids' classic The Very Hungry Caterpillar by Eric Carle was first published. And although sometimes on this show we're relaxed about reading the works that we discuss from cover to cover, I will admit to skimming the King James Bible, I'm hoping that as this text is just 224 words long, we have all read it in preparation for today's episode. Rebecca, I am looking at you as the one without children.
I have not read it. We can get into this later. Guys, I told you about this on the chat when we first talked about doing this. I find it stressful to consume media where people are forced to consume a lot of food. I can't watch Figuratively episode where she eats all the Christmas dinners. I knew I couldn't handle this. I hated the tiger who came to tea because he ate everything that they had and that made me stressed.
You are a unique and delicate flower, Rebecca.
Yes. But I will tell you though, I am familiar with the premise.
Well, Arion, perhaps you could summarise the premise for us, for those who haven't read it, since I know you've read it thousands of times.
Okay, well, Rebecca, he or she isn't actually forced to eat anything. This is the story of a caterpillar who hatches one day from an egg. Pop!
I'm just having the experience of being one of Arion's children, and I didn't hate it.
And then it makes its way through a load of different foodstuffs, yes, so there is that gluttonous component. And on the final day, it eats this load of sugary, junky snacks, and it gets a total tummy ache, goes to bed inside its cocoon, and then wakes up as a beautiful butterfly and flaps its way away.
Yeah, I prefer Eric Carle's version. I mean, Arion's summary was succinct, but less poetic.
Well, it turns out that apparently Carle's original idea was the very hungry worm, because he was using a hole puncher one day and he started thinking about bookworms and like the idea of a children's book where the pages were literally being eaten by a bookworm. But as is often the case, it was the insight of his editor that gave it that final touch of genius, specifically World's editor-in-chief Anne Beneducci, who after listening to his pitch said, "How about a caterpillar?"
Right. Yeah. It sold more than 55 million copies around the world. It's been translated into 70 languages, and it's actually one of the 70 books that Eric Carle published over his career. And in total, he has sold 170 million copies of all of those. So he's kind of a big deal in children's publishing.
But the point is, though, Rebecca, you still have plenty of time to catch up because Carle himself didn't actually become a children's author until he was coming up to his 40th birthday. The same age I was when I created this show. Not all pivots are financially rewarding. He'd been an art director on Madison Avenue and had been approached by someone who had seen one of his adverts that he'd designed, Bill Martin Jr., children's author, to collaborate on his picture book, Brown Bear, What Do You See? And then having designed the pictures for that, he felt the pull of the medium and decided to embrace this as a new career. In his 40s, I'm going to be I was going to say children's author. He called himself a picture writer. He was a collagist. So the way that he worked, the way that he made those distinctive images, is he'd build up illustrations with layers of paint and tissue paper and then photograph them.
Yeah, I mean, Carle was really lucky. This was his first foray into children's literature, and it was a massive hit. You know, Brown Bear, What Do You See? Went on to sell 8 million copies, became a staple of nurseries and libraries around the world. It was briefly banned from Texas schools in 2010 after the State Board of Education confused Bill Martin Jr., author of The Little Squeegee Bug, with Bill Martin, author of Ethical Marxism, The Categorical Imperative of Liberation.
Well, Eric Carle himself was born in Syracuse in upstate New York to German parents who, with his mother homesick, returned to their native country in 1935 when Eric was just 6.
A pretty wild time to head back to Germany.
Yeah, you'd have to say.
You never hear about travel in that direction, do you? You never hear an American say, yeah, in the 1930s, my family went back to Nazi Germany. It seemed like the logical thing to do.
Certainly not from people who haven't subsequently been cancelled. And it's weird that this doesn't sort of hang over him because he was actually conscripted during the war. He wasn't old enough to be a soldier, but he was sent to dig trenches for the Nazis, which he described later as a pretty traumatic experience, unsurprisingly. But then after the war, he enrolled at the State Academy of Fine Arts in his home hometown of Stuttgart, where he studied graphic design. And after graduating, he then freelanced as a commercial artist and became quite well known in Germany. But America really loomed large in his mind, and he always wanted to go to the place that he regarded as home. And that was why he eventually moved back to New York in 1952, and he started work in the promotional department of the New York Times, thanks to Leo Lionni, who is a designer who became a close friend, who also found fame later in life as a children's book author too.
Yeah, and then he was conscripted again. It was now the Korean War, and as a US citizen, he was called up. And he was stationed in, drumroll, Germany, the place he just managed to escape.
Digging trenches again? Was back to the trenches.
Luckily this time in the mailroom, and then returned to the US, where he ultimately then worked his way up an ad agency to become the art director. He was never conscripted or forcibly transported to a different country again.
I mean, you can overly psychoanalyze something like The Very Hungry Caterpillar, but since it is the most popular children's book of all time, I think some of that biography is worth thinking about in terms of what the book's about and what it represents, because the caterpillar of all animals has this double life, doesn't it? Which is the big surprise at the end. You know, it becomes a beautiful butterfly. And even as an adult, you kind of forget that that's what's about to happen because you're enjoying the business about what is he. I'm saying he. You correctly identified earlier, Arion, that the gender is non-specific. Mm-hmm. What are they eating as they go through the book? But then you get the butterfly. And I do wonder for Carle, you know, as someone who was a German and an American, both things, when it would have been difficult to be both things in each of those respective countries, whether that double life played into the story a bit. And also whether, I mean, he talked about the greys, browns and dirty greens used by the Nazis to camouflage the buildings. Whether just the drabness of Germany both times that he visited influenced his very colourful style about being an American. You know, he's so identified as an American author, isn't he? By Americans. You know, The Very Hungry Caterpillar is an American tale. He eats American foods, doesn't he? Lollipops and stuff. Right. And yet, you know, if you ever see Carle interviewed, he has still had traces of a German accent. Like, it was there. He was both.
Yes.
I mean, luckily for us, unlike Harold Pinter and his ilk, Carle was very forthcoming about explaining the motivation behind the book. He said it is a metaphor for entering school, and it's meant to help prepare children for the unknown, giving them a positive model for the transition from the familiar world of home to the unfamiliar world of school.
Whoa.
But the actual root of the book came from, again, those childhood experiences in Germany. His father was drafted into the Wehrmacht, and his father was then taken prisoner by the Soviets, and when he came back, he was just a completely changed man, you know, mentally and physically very traumatized, and they never really had the same relationship again. And Carle said that later, working on Brown Bear with Bill Martin Jr. reignited the memory of the things he liked to do with his father when he was a small child, which was go on these forest walks. His father knew a lot about nature and would describe things to him, and sort of ignited this love of flora and fauna. And so when he started working on a children's book for the first time, that brought back all those positive memories of his childhood, and that's what made him decide that he would go into children's literature himself.
Yeah, and in fact, all of his books for kids pretty much revolve around nature. That's the thing that he kept returning to time and time again. But also, it's the parents who choose what they read to little children, isn't it? So, I mean, why do parents pick up The Very Hungry Caterpillar? One, I think, is because actually it has a sort of retro 1960s vibe to it. It's the same reason that I liked The Phantom Tollbooth when I was a kid. Is there something about those colours, and you know it's of the 60s somehow, which growing up post-1980 has felt cool. The other thing is, as a parent, you feel like it's educational too, because you're counting the food, you're learning to identify the fruit, you're sequencing the days of the week, you're learning about metamorphosis, so there's lessons in it. And it's not just like madly complex like a lot of kids' books are these days, where they just throw a lot of stuff at you, like dinosaurs on tractors and tickle monsters and flaps, and it's just like, oh, what's this about? Like, it's a really simple story that has a really simple mechanic, which is you get to turn the flaps and see each piece of food, and the kid gets to play with it, and you get to teach them something. Yeah,
I think you're right. Like, it's got an appeal to parents too. It's not about weird things. It's about something that parents and children can both understand and both follow. And by the end of 1969, it was a hit. Took a few months to catch on, but that year the New York Times chose it as one of its outstanding children's books of the year, you know, and ultimately could go on to sell millions and billions of copies. You know, it quickly became seen as a classic, and that's why it feels like it's always been around, which is why, in an infamous incident in 1999, the then governor of Texas, George W. Bush, was asked to name his favorite childhood book. He said The Very Hungry Caterpillar, but if you can do the maths, you will quickly realize that today in history on its publication, he was 23 years old.
Maybe that's when he started reading. Who knows?
Tomorrow.
These deep green veins marbling the curds.
But he ate it anyway, and that's how you know he's French.
Right.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/retrospectors.